Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going on a journey, and honestly, it's a profound one. It's the inward hero's journey. We're going to explore a phenomenon that, let's be real, so many of us feel but rarely understand. You know that feeling where outward success, the exact thing we're told to strive for, somehow just leaves us with this quiet crisis of inner emptiness? You might literally have everything you're supposed to have, yet feel like you're living a life that doesn't quite belong to you. Well, using the absolutely brilliant insights of Carl Jung, we're going to map out exactly why that happens and, more importantly, how to find your way back.
Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to think about your own day, just today. How many decisions did you make because they genuinely felt right in your gut? And how many did you make simply because you knew they'd be accepted by everyone else? Most people never stop to ask this. But what happens when you finally do? What happens when you stop measuring your entire existence against the world's expectations and start listening to something deeper? You see, a lot of us are succeeding, sure, but we might just be succeeding at the completely wrong game. We might literally be living someone else's life.
So, part one, the crisis of success, or as I like to think of it, playing the wrong game.
Let's look at Sarah. She works in marketing out in New York. She gets promoted, her colleagues praise her work constantly, her boss calls her indispensable. By every possible metric, she is winning. But in a quiet moment, she confessed, "I don't know who I am anymore." She took promotions she didn't even want just because they looked good. She rented an apartment that wasn't her style at all, purely because it impressed her friends. She is absolutely exhausted, but not from failure. She's exhausted because she's basically navigating a forest without a compass, just turning left because, well, everyone else is turning left. And Sarah's exhaustion brilliantly illustrates what modern neuroscience calls external regulation. This is when your emotional state depends entirely on outside feedback. And hey, from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes total sense. We evolved in tribes, right? Belonging meant safety, rejection literally meant death, so our brains learned to constantly scan other people's faces for approval. It's exactly why getting a slightly passive-aggressive Slack message feels like a life-or-death survival scenario to your nervous system. In the modern world, this creates what Buddhist monks call the monkey mind. You're constantly jumping from branch to branch, looking everywhere for safety except inside yourself. Your nervous system just never gets a break because you're always performing, always waiting, always checking.
Moving on to Section 2, Unmasking the Persona, the Social Mask.
When you finally realize you've been living through other people's eyes, this really quiet, intense question starts to creep in. Who exactly has been living in my place all these years? We're going to look at a psychological structure you built so quietly that you probably forgot you even built it. So the crucial point here is that this social mask, what Jung called the persona, isn't a sickness. It's not a flaw. You learned it in childhood to help you adapt and stay safe in groups. It was a super useful tool. But the problem starts when you forget it's only a role. Take David. He's a finance executive with this flawless, totally controlled professional persona. Every single time he wants to do something different, his mind just floods with panic. Wait, will they judge me? Or consider Elena, a content creator with thousands of followers. She has lived so long inside her perfect online image that she's totally lost the feeling of living authentically. Her anxiety actually comes from having absolutely nowhere left to take the mask off. The tool basically mutated into a trap.
The ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus actually understood this perfectly. He taught that we have two roles, the role given to us by society and our authentic nature beneath all that. The massive fundamental mistake we make is forgetting which is which. When you fully identify with that societal role, you start developing an addiction to recognition. You literally need praise just to feel okay. And hey, you aren't being shallow, you've just misplaced your entire sense of worth into the mask instead of your authentic nature.
Carl Jung described this with some seriously heavy words. The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. Just let that land for a second. At first, the persona protects you, right? It makes you acceptable to the tribe. But over time, there's this subtle cruelty to it. The dynamic shifts. It no longer protects you from the world. Instead, it actually starts protecting the world from your true self. And a mask is simply not meant to hold your soul.
Which brings us to Section 3, facing your shadow, getting out of the comparison trap.
So what actually happens when you start to loosen that heavy mask? Because the moment you do, an old reflex immediately wakes up. You start looking sideways. You start checking if other people are moving faster, achieving more, living bigger lives. Loosening the mask instantly triggers the incredibly dangerous, completely exhausting trap of social comparison. Jung saw that comparison isn't just simple insecurity, it is a total denial of your individual path. Let's look at Marcus. He works in tech out in San Francisco. For years, he felt so behind his friends who had houses and status. He kept jumping between jobs and cities, feeling like a massive failure. Until one day he was forced to stop and realized, Wait, he was never lost. He was just walking a different path. Sure, it was slower in social terms, but it was so much deeper internally. When you live in comparison, you are racing on a timeline that was never yours to begin with. You're expending all this energy on speed when what you actually need is direction.
Now, what's really interesting is how we handle that fear of judgment once the mask comes off. Enter the shadow. Now, the shadow isn't evil. It's simply the parts of yourself you've denied or rejected or stuffed in a closet. When a belief is too painful to hold, your mind just projects it outward onto everyone else. Take Priya, who worked in corporate communications. She constantly feared her colleagues didn't respect her. Every innocent question felt like a brutal criticism. But when she finally looked deeper, she found a hidden belief she'd carried since childhood. I am not good enough. Because she couldn't accept it, she projected it outward, basically forcing her colleagues to carry her own self-doubt. The world you fear often perfectly mirrors what you haven't dared to face within yourself.
Section 4. The Crucible of Solitude. Finding that sacred space. Once you withdraw those projections and finally stop comparing yourself to others, something really unexpected happens. The noise quiets down. The endless performing stops. And in that space, a terrifying but incredibly sacred silence settles in. Jung defined this reality of solitude not as loneliness, not as abandonment, but as a sacred space. People are terrified of this silence, honestly, because when there is no one left to distract you, your unexamined inner conflicts absolutely demand attention. Look at Jessica. She was always busy, always connected, until her job ended suddenly. Her first week alone was agonizing, just excruciating. But by week 3, sitting in the quiet, she finally heard what she'd been drowning out for years, her own voice. Temporary withdrawal from the noise of society isn't an escape. It is a required condition to finally hear who you actually are.
Section 5. Building inner discipline. Time to build those deep roots. Once you finally hear that inner voice, you start building the invisible roots of your tree deep underground. Because think about it, if you only feed the leaves and shape the canopy just to look good to everyone else, your ego is going to completely collapse during the very first storm of hardship. This beautiful quote from Jung really grounds the theory for us. The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no universal recipe, only your rhythm. True inner discipline isn't about forcing yourself through someone else's crazy 10-step productivity hack or some grueling self-improvement bootcamp. It's about daily commitment to what is true for you, finding your personal rhythm and sticking to it, especially when absolutely no one is clapping for you.
Let's see how this actually builds in practice. Consider James. He worked in super fast-paced finance. After severely burning out, he didn't launch some dramatic public comeback tour. No, he simply adopted this totally uncelebrated silent routine. Waking earlier, reading in silence, reflecting, and focusing on one true task. No praise, no recognition. He literally didn't tell a soul. But he became calmer, clearer, and far less swept away by external pressure. It was just a quiet accumulation of kept promises to himself, aligned with his inner truth rather than external applause.
And what's wild is that modern neuroscience completely backs up what Jung observed decades ago. When action is driven by external recognition, by praise, likes, applause, the brain fatigues super quickly. But when action is driven by intrinsic meaning and personal motivation, the nervous system can actually maintain focus. This kind of inner discipline is lonely, sure, and it produces absolutely no impressive story for social media, but it is deeply, profoundly sustainable.
And that leads us to our final section, Section 6, Coming Home to Yourself, Achieving Inner Coherence.
So you've strengthened your roots, but you might still feel that subtle, lingering wish to be seen. You might wonder if you're failing just because you aren't getting that outside confirmation anymore. But that isn't failure. That is inner coherence taking shape, where the maturing ego stops using the outside world as a mirror for its own worth. Let's walk through this psychological timeline together. In childhood, the ego is immature. It builds the mask for safety and desperately needs the world to tell it that it exists. In adulthood, we experience the slow, grinding exhaustion of keeping up that performance. But then comes the shift, the sacred silence, where we withdraw those projections. Finally, we reach maturity. At this stage, your psychic energy stops flowing outward, desperately waiting to return as praise. Instead, it seeps inward, nourishing your roots. Value no longer comes from status. It comes from inner unity, that deep, unshakable sense that what you live, think, and do are finally perfectly aligned.
The wild paradox of all of this is that the exact moment you stop seeking your place in the world no longer has the power to shake you. You become solid, rooted, awake. So the question isn't whether you should focus on yourself. The real question is, how long will you wait to begin? How many more days are you going to live through other people's eyes? The compass you have been searching for everywhere else, it has been waiting inside you all along, right here, right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to think on that.